G'day, it's Time Poor Dad here. Well, the new He-Man movie's coming out, and I'm pretty pumped. I've been a fan since childhood. He was one of my first heroes, alongside Superman, Luke Skywalker, and Optimus Prime. The Masters of the Universe was very unique because it mixed so many different genres together. It was sci-fi fantasy, with magic, monsters, and barbarians inhabiting a world with robots, spaceships, and computers. However, this is actually what many pulp novels were like back in the 60s and the 70s, and it's got me thinking about my favourite literary barbarian and the fantasy genre in general. It's actually not who many of you think it is going to be, despite my love of Arnie's epic performance in Conan. But to understand who I'm talking about, I've got to take you back to my childhood and my love-hate relationship with fantasy literature. As a kid, I hated reading. It was a boring chore, and I'd much rather be out playing with action figures, watching cartoons, and drawing. I never read for fun, but was always enchanted by the artwork on fantasy novels. This was a problem because fantasy back in the 1990s was primarily a literary genre. Sure, I'd watched the BBC production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I was an obsessed fan of the ultra-violent 1981 film Excalibur, but it seemed to really get into fantasy, I'd have to bite the bullet and actually open a book and read. Back in 1993, when I was 12 years old, I collected and read a fortnightly fantasy magazine series called The Ancestral Trail. Over 24 issues, I read the story of Richard, a bit of a self-insert teenage boy who had to save the ancestral realm from the evil one, as he was the chosen one. It was derivative and episodic, but I was hooked, helped in no small part by the epic and atmospheric artwork. Emboldened by my experience, I decided to buy some fantasy novels from the local bookshop. Well, what did I do? I went straight up to the Lord of the Rings. It was huge, Bible huge, and expensive. So I decided to give The Hobbit a crack. It was a prequel, so seemed like a good place to start. It was also called a children's book, so it shouldn't have been too difficult to read. I remember reading chapter 1 and thinking something was off. It was so freaking hard. The words just didn't flow as I read about holes in the ground, wizards scratching symbols onto doors, and dwarves wearing silver hoods. It was boring, and my reading stamina was painfully weak. I was like a lazy fatty who decided to run a marathon after spending a few weeks at the gym. Reality hit me hard. Well, I struggled through the first few chapters, the songs about the dishes, singing elves, and gave up just after the trolls. I'd used that pick as a bit of a beacon of hope, but when I got to it, the Cockney accents just failed to meet my expectation. There was no action. I gave fantasy a rest, and then in 1994 jumped into the X-Men comics. Well, 3 years of X-Men stories saved my education and increased my reading stamina dramatically. I can safely say that X-Men comics paved the way for me to become a university grad and then a teacher. In 1997, I was in the 10th grade, and I did an elective English course on the fantasy genre. And guess what? We read The Hobbit. However, this time it was easy and enjoyable. Well, maybe not the songs. I've always struggled with Tolkien's songs because I don't know the tune. So, based upon this positive experience, I decided to buy Lord of the Rings and give it a go. For years, I'd looked at it in the school library, and it had taunted me as the ultimate fantasy book, if only you were brave enough to read it. I didn't want to borrow it, though. I wanted to own it. That's just in my nature. So, I managed to get through Bilbo Baggins's 111st birthday. That was a boring, tedious chapter. However, I started to really enjoy it once they're talking about the background history of the ring and the flight from the Shire. I even slogged through Tom Bombadil. That was okay. Wasn't as bad as people make out. However, I just couldn't bring myself to persevere through the Council of Elrond. The endless history bore me and I stopped reading. That year, I actually found other books. I started reading history, especially Wild West history. I developed a passion for non-fiction and biography. And I actually did quite well then in my Year 12 exams and got into uni. How about that? I just enjoyed non-fiction a lot more than fiction. However, in 2001, I heard that there was a new Lord of the Rings movie coming out, and it was coming out by Christmas. Well, if I was ever to have a pure Lord of the Rings literary experience, uninfluenced by the films, then I had to read it now. I gave it another shot, and I enjoyed it, especially The Fellowship of the Ring. The Bridge of Khazad-dûm was generally thrilling. However, by the Two Towers, the walking and the lengthy descriptions of complex scenery was honestly starting to become a little bit tiresome. When I finished The Return of the King before the movie, well, I was pretty chuffed. However, I almost failed to enjoy the film upon first watch as I was comparing every difference with the book. I honestly felt let down by Gollum falling into a pit of lava, as it seemed so painfully cliche. But I had to remind myself that this was where it all started. Everyone else had copied that. Well, I'd finally read Lord of the Rings, and I must say that I'm glad I did it in the same way that we're glad that we ate our vegetables or did a marathon. I enjoyed it, sort of. It's good for you, but wouldn't you rather sit on the couch and eat pizza for entertainment? I hate to say it, but Tolkien was a bit of a chore, and I felt like I had to read him because he was the grandfather of the genre. The movies rectified many of his narrative shortcomings, and I can only imagine how secretly disappointed younger people are who saw the films first before reading the books. Years later, I would read the infamous Lord of the Rings clone, The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks. While clearly a cheap knockoff, Brooks can write well. It just flowed into me. So think about it like this. If Tolkien is a healthy steak, Brooks is a greasy cheeseburger. Sometimes you don't want to chew. Sometimes junk food is what you're after. Anyway, what on earth does this have to do with barbarians? Well, bear with me. You see, I'm a Western and action movie fan. The Man with the Gun is my favorite hero. So it's not too much of a stretch to enjoy the Man with the Sword genre. Basically, sword and sorcery. So, in one of my many attempts to again enjoy the fantasy genre, I decided to give Conan a go. I loved the Arnie film and thought, let's read some Robert E. Howard. Once again, the movie took a character from literature and made him superior. I just couldn't enjoy his dated stories. They were painfully different from what I expected. Even the much hyped Frost Giant's daughter just failed to excite me. Where was all the gore and sex? When people said Conan, I wanted the hero from a 1980s hair metal song. I wanted R-rated He-Man. So the search began. I read some Michael Moorcock's Elric, but it was not playful enough. This was in the early to mid 2000s, so the internet was limited, and much of my information on fantasy authors came from a really snarkily written ultimate encyclopedia of fantasy. I scoured the second-hand bookshops of my hometown Katoomba, mainly choosing books based upon the cover illustration. What was I after? Pulp, metal bikinis and muscles. And then I discovered Thongor by Lynn Carter. I actually bought the book as a joke because of the Tamu knockoff Conan on the cover. It looked bad. The art was no Frank Franzetta. But that was actually a good thing. I had found my cheeseburger. Lynn Carter's Thongor is not original. It's derivative. He's described as a derivative hack by that encyclopedia. Well, it's actually a brilliant synthesis of everything that I was after, and it's well written. Now, my sister, who's a writer, would question that. I would often provoke her by saying that my favorite genre of literature is barbarian fiction, a genre which she regards as little above novelizations of movies based upon video games. Mortal Kombat, the official book from the motion picture, anyone? But to me, Thongor is my comfort food, my cold pizza the morning after. Let's take a closer look why. So, let's talk Thongor. So, Thongor is actually a series of, about 6 novels. It starts off with The Wizard of Lemuria, and it's everything that you'd expect it to be. 500,000 years ago, on the lost continent of Lemuria, the first civilizations arose from the red murk of barbarism. For 1,000 years, they struggled to vanquish the cruel reptilian race of dragon kings and finally drove them from the land.
And despite the primitive beasts and the terrors of primordial magic, the kingdoms of Lumeria flourished. But danger lurked in the inner sea, where the last of the Dragon Kings awaited their hour of vengeance. Now the stars were approaching the right configuration, the human realms were restless, and the night of destruction was at hand. Only the warrior Thongor, barbarian from the north, and Sarajesha, whom men called the Wizard of Lemuria, could stand against the terrors of a bygone age. I certainly hope I got that wizard's name right. Zaraja. I think that's it. So there's actually 6 books in the series. It starts off with The Wizard of Lemuria. Then the second book I actually don't have. It's Thongor of Lemuria. Basically, he becomes the king of the kingdom, marries the princess, and he's in charge. He's like the benevolent barbarian king. In the third book, his princess is kidnapped, and this is, I think... Oh... No, it's not quite the first time he versus Mardnax. Mardnax is sort of one of his main foes. I think his first foray against Mardnax is Thongor and the City of Magicians. And I'm going to read a little bit about this because it's got some of my favourite passages. Well, we think Mardnax is vanquished, but he comes back in the 4th book until finally it's Thongor against the pirates of Tarakis. Okay? And so they're pulp, they're really, really enjoyable. They're not highbrow, but they're just written in such a distinctive and delicious style. So I'm going to read a little bit of Thongor and the City of Magicians. And don't worry, I'm not going to do any spoilers. But we get to one of the absolutely pivotal sections. And so Thongor's been captured. And the bad guys, they're trying to summon a demon, and Thongor's the sacrifice. So I'm going to read a little bit of it. And this is why, this is sort of my go-to barbarian novel. The Temple of the Black Gods was a titanic hall of black marble where stupendous pillars like stone sequoias bore a vast dome of crimson crystal 90 yards above the tiled floor. The circular walls were ringed with rising tier on tier of stone benches like some infernal amphitheatre, whereupon in their rustling hundreds gathered the priests of Tsar to observe the fantastic spectacle of Thongor's doom. In the centre of this walled and dome-roofed amphitheatre, a colossal idol loomed up against the crimson light. Like some supernal and malignant giant frozen into living rock, it stood, a graven atlas of tremendous proportions, whose cliff-like shoulders bore not one, but 3 heads. Beneath this triple-headed idol of chaos was a row of 9 vari-coloured thrones, and between the spread legs of the stone giant rose a cube of black marble 10 feet high, glistening in the fiery glow of flaming lamps. Standing atop the marble cube of the black altar, Thongor stood, his arms stretched out and bound with chains of gold that stretched to either side of the cube. The hour of sacrifice had come. Bronze bells groaned and trumpets screamed like the brazen-throated harpies. One by one, the lords and priests of Tsar took their place in the row of 9 thrones. Slobbering, obscene, Pytumathon, gross in fantastic purple. Sharganath of the Nulled in quiet subdued grey. Bold, black-bearded, swaggering Maldirth in blazing scarlet. Lean Zoth the Skull, eyes burning with sick fanaticism, wrapped in robes of blue. Mighty Mardnax, masked and robed in ebon black. And Vol the Brain, his dwarven form and wobbling, hideously swollen head, robed and hooded in emerald green, borne in the mighty arms of a dull-eyed, blank-faced Ramahol slave that only Thongor knew was Shangoth of the Jegga. A dull moaning chant rose from the crowded stone. A dull moaning chant rose from the crowded stone benches that circled the titanic hall. It rose and ebbed, drowning and roaring like a sea. The rite was begun. Now could come the test. And so basically over the next few pages, Vol does a enchantment. They're trying to summon a demon, and Thongor is the sacrifice. And so there's various prayers, and just as it's building up, this is where the real action comes, and this is where, it's maximum excitement. A breath of that cold wind struck Thongor, chilling him to the bone, cold as the wind that blows forever between the stars, as he stared up into the whirling funnel of blackness that was growing huger and more solid, and drifting down towards the place where he stood chained and helpless. So the demon is appearing, has been summoned. Then it was that Shangoth struck. From beneath the enveloping cloak of green, he drew his great war axe and the mighty Valkyrian broadsword that Mardanax had taken from Thongor at his capture. Shangoth had found the sword in his wanderings through the citadel of Zar, and had borne both weapons into the temple, hidden beneath his voluminous green cloak. Now he raised his axe and let it fall in a terrific whistling stroke that severed the enormously swollen head of Vol from his shriveled thin neck, as a rotten fruit is struck from a twig. Eyes still glaring with cold intensity and concentration, mouth still moving in spasms, forming unspoken words of summons and command, the hideously distended head of the dwarf enchanter rolled to the foot of the black throne, whereupon Mardanax sat frozen, rolled to the foot of the black dais and thudded like dead meat against the marble step. Spouting a sickly pale ichor from the raw stump of its neck, the shrunken, insignificant body slumped and fell forward, toppling from the podium before the blazing book of power, quivered and lay still forever. As if a knife blade were drawn across a thousand shouting throats, the thunderous rhythm of the great invocation was cut off. Silence crashed down in suffocating weight upon the awestruck magnitude. Roaring his deep-throated jagged battle cry, Shangoth sprang with a single great leap to the black altar, whereupon Thongor stood. The axe whistled again through the dark air, and the golden chains rang like tiny bells against the black marble as the blade clove through and severed them. Thongor was free. With a great booming cry of battle lust and joy, the Lord of the West caught his own beloved broadsword as the Prince of the Jagger flung it sparkling through the air towards him. Now, with his mighty sword in his good right hand, he felt fit enough to do battle with the very gods of darkness. Mardanax rose to his full height there upon the dais of the black chair, and extended his staff towards Shangoth, bellowing his battle song. The 8-foot warrior sprang to meet him, but a ray of green light shot from the tip of the staff and bathed his mighty form in a flickering nimbus of pallid, throbbing force. The blue-skinned giant froze motionless as a statue of graven stone. Atop of the black altar, Thongor prepared himself for one last magnificent battle against his enemies. But even as the muscles bunched in his strong, powerful legs, even as he gathered his strength for a giant leap that would carry him to the foot of the black throne, he felt himself seized in the grip of an eerie force, a tingling electric coldness that probed down like a ray of darkness from the hovering spiral cloud that hung above him. The frigid grip of a numbing paralysis held him motionless, unable to move. The sucking, gnawing cold benumbed his brain, dulling his mind, robbing the strength from his body. He felt as if cold hands grasped at the very roots of his soul. So once again, we see barbarian courage being foiled by magic. What's going to happen? Well, you're just going to have to read it yourself. I'm not going to spoil it. So that's basically why I love this. And sorry if I garbled some of the words. Some of these words are a little bit hard to pronounce when you're reading it really fast, but it's a great read. So give Thongor a go if you really want what I call the cheeseburger of barbarian fiction. Time Poor Dad out.